Wow, what a great crowd. Thanks, everyone, for coming here. I'm Terry Snyder. I'm the librarian of the college, and my pleasure to introduce Ashley Foster. And she will introduce our prestigious cast of scholars here that will present their wonderful scholarship and thoughts. J. Ashley Foster is a visiting assistant professor of writing and a fellow in the writing program here at Haverford. Her dissertation, which she defended in 2014, is entitled Modernism's Impossible Witness, Peace Testimonies from the Modernist Wars. And she did that under the guidance of Jane Marcus. Her impressive CV documents many invited lectures, presentations, and publications. Her articles have been published in, I didn't know there were as many Virginia Woolf publications, but I'm going to list a few of them. Virginia Woolf Writing the World, Virginia Woolf and 20th Century Women Writers, the Virginia Woolf Miscellany, the Virginia Woolf Bulletin, and Interdisciplinary, Multidisciplinary Woolf. Her article, Stopped at the Border, has been reprinted in Adbusters magazine, and her forthcoming article, entitled Recovering Pacifism's Past, Modernist Networks, the Society of Friends, and Peace Movement of the Spanish Civil War, will be published in Quakers in Literature in April of 2016. Ashley and her students from both the last spring and this fall 2015 writing seminar entitled Peace Testimonies in Literature and Art are curators of an interactive exhibit that's opening just now called Testimonies in Art and Action, Igniting Pacifism in the Face of Total War. The exhibit runs through December 11th, and it explores pacifism, social justice, and the relationship between art, activism, and the interwar years. Ashley's own work, of course, examines the intersection between pacifism, modernism, and war, and tries to recuperate the lost threads of modernism's pacifist history. I want to pull at that thread a bit. We often talk in the libraries about the idea of dialectic engagement with ideas and the iterative process of writing and research. And one of the things that I've particularly loved about watching this exhibit unfold is how Ashley actually incorporates that dialectic, the interrogation of the source material, the curiosity, the engagement with those ideas in an iterative fashion, the sort of development of those ideas, sort of gathering all those threads and really weaving it into this exhibit, into the story that you'll see in a few minutes. And that's been really impressive. I think it's Haverford at its best. So I want to thank Ashley for that work. And I'll turn the podium over to Ashley.
Thank you, Terry. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I am very grateful for this opportunity to share the work of these four scholars with you, and for the support and encouragement I've received from the Haverford community. The vision for Testimonies in Art and Action, Igniting Pacifism in the Face of Total War, started with this panel. 3 Guineas, Pacifist Activism, and the Event of Total War. I wanted to bring these scholars to campus because each and every one of them has contributed to the scholarship on peace and to themes of the writing seminar, Peace Testimonies in Literature and Art. The students from this class were working on their digital humanities projects when I started talking with people about the panel, and I thought how constructive it would be if the students could share their work with the panelists the same way that the panelists would share their thoughts with the students. So I approached Terry and I asked if we could find a space for a 2-hour pop-up digital exhibition where we projected the student projects on the walls. She immediately said yes, and then asked if instead of 2 hours, we could turn this idea into a standing exhibition of several months. She totally expanded the vision of this. Working alongside the library staff and the Haverford community has been an exhilarating experience for everyone here has helped to make manifest, in Virginia Woolf's words, a collaborative vision that include the voices of the freshmen from the spring peace testimonies in literature and art, who I see several of here, and 6 students who worked over the summer on this project. I would also like to take a moment to reflect. Many of us here today, whether knowingly or unknowingly, have been affected by a great loss to the Woolf, the feminist, and the modernist community that occurred over the summer. On May 28th, the great scholar and my mentor, Jane Marcus, passed away. The spirit of Jane's pacifist, feminist, socialist ethos pervades all that we do today, all the ethical considerations on our dossier of thought. In the beginning of Art and Anger, reading Like a Woman, Jane says, "What, in any case, is a socialist feminist criticism?" The answer is a simple one. It wants to change the subject, end quote. In following this directive, this imperative now issued from the universe itself, we are here to change the subject, to discuss strategies of peace instead of strategies of war, to change the fatalistic, overwritten conversation from war as an inevitability to war as an individual, social, and communal choice. Three Guineas, Pacifist Activism, and the Event of Total War aims to create a scholarly discussion focused on the themes of pacifism, activism, writing and ethics, forms of resistance to total war, and social justice during the interwar period. By bringing this panel together, I hope to create a space where we can think through some of the ways that alternative pacifist narratives have protested the onslaught of total war in the 20th century, challenging the notion that the only way to fight force is with force. The students of the Peace Testimonies in Literature and Art Writing Seminar have been engaged in reading the pacifist and social justice traces within modernist works and exploring how these works interact with the pacifist movements of their time, particularly the Quaker Relief Mission in Spain. The students and I are recovering the lost threads of modernism's pacifist histories, and we are using selections from each of these scholars here as theoretical underpinnings that guide our endeavors. Throughout this course, we have been exploring how art and literature manifest divergent and convergent peace testimonies, a term borrowed from the Quakers. In order to start our discussion, I have proposed several framing questions to the panelists that I will share with you now. Topic 1, what is the relation between writing and ethics? How do we conceptualize the claims the other makes on us as citizens in a global world? How can writing unveil or respond to these claims? How can writing help us undo the war machine? Topic 2, how does one respond ethically to the advent of total war? How do we consider the work that writing does as an ethical response? How does your work frame or consider the engagement between writing and history? Topic 3, what models can we consider for responding ethically to total war that we can use to think through nonviolent responses to total war? How do we see the issues, concern, and responses to total war during the interwar era as pertinent or importable into our own present moment? What role do the archives play in our resistances to war? How do we generate a critical historical response that leaves future possibilities open, but reorients and redirects trajectories of war? What are some definitions or aspects of pacifism that have become important to your own work? And lastly, how do we as scholars and thinkers, or how do our subjects of study contend with the fact that aestheticized representations of war can, as Susan Sontag has written, simultaneously act as a, quote, call for peace, a cry for revenge, end quote. Once I had a student ask me, what do I do with the fact that Guernica conveys such horror, but is so beautiful to look at? The question still haunts me. What are the ethics of viewing, reading, highly aestheticized and at bottom, beautiful depictions of war? Each of our scholars has been asked to give a short presentation, and then we will join together in a roundtable discussion of these and any other themes that the panelists feel so moved to speak upon. We will then have time for a question and answer session. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the incredible community support the students and I have received in making both the panel discussion and the standing exhibition happen. The curators would like to express gratitude to Haverford College Libraries, especially the contributions of Lori Allen, Bruce Bumbarger, Dan Berger-Linehan, Sarah Horowitz, Terry Snyder, and David Cook, as well as Madeline Hodges, Nate Ream-Daly, Shazim Nazim from Digital Scholarship, Natalia Gutierrez-Jones from Quaker and Special Collections, Caroline Fleet, Rebecca Hickey, Emma Bullock, and Sophie Frank from Conservation. We would like to offer our appreciation for the Ethical Inquiry Course Development Fund awarded by the Office of the Provost, which helped fund the development of our digital platform. We are also grateful to the Hertford Center for the Arts and Humanities, the Distinguished Visitors Office, and the Center for Peace and Global Citizen for their sponsorship. Many thanks to the writing program, the Concentration in Peace, Justice, and Human Rights, and the Quaker Affairs Office and administration at Haverford College for their contributions and support. Our appreciation also goes to the Society of Authors in Great Britain and Southern Connecticut State University for providing access to the digital archives of the Three Guineas Reading Notebooks, to the Library of the Religious Society of Friends at Friends House in London, to the archives of the American Friends Service Committee at Cherry Street in Philadelphia, and to the Royal Albert Hall Archives in London for allowing us to reproduce their archival images in the collage and on the walls. And a big thank you to students Christina Bowen, Adetomi Wafamadou, Anne Victoria Isaac, Sophie McGlynn, Marcelo Jorge Volpe, and Ian Wheeler for dedicating their summer hours to help with this exhibition. And finally, I would like to express thanks and warm welcome to our guest panelists. Jane Marcus, in Some Notes on Radical Teaching, writes, quote, "To lobby for peace, to occupy public space for peace, is our imperative. If, as the poet says, the war works hard, we must pledge our energies to making the peace work harder." End quote. All of the scholars who have joined this discussion contribute to the work for peace. Jessica Berman is professor of English, Gender, Women's Studies, and Language, Literacy, and Culture at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where she also served as chair of English from 2006 to 2012. She is currently editing a companion to Virginia Woolf for Wiley Blackwell, due out in 2015, and is at work on a book investigating the role of exiles and migrants in the development of new media throughout the 20th century, with focus on radio, film, television, and digital media. Her book, Modernist Commitments, Ethics, Politics, and Transnational Modernism, was published in 2011. Jean Mills is Associate Professor of English at John Jay College, CUNY. She is the author of Virginia Woolf, Jane Ellen Harrison, and the Spirit of Modernist Classicism. Her essay, The Writer, the Prince, and the Scholar, Virginia Woolf, D.S. Mirsky, and Jane Harrison's translation from the Russian of the Life of the Archpriest of Achem by himself, has been anthologized in Leonard and Virginia Woolf, the Hogarth Press, and the Networks of Modernism. Farah Mendelsohn is head of Department for English Communication, Film, and Media of Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge, England. Her previous work includes Diana Wynne Jones and the Children's Fantastic Tradition and Rhetorics of Fantasy, and she is editor of On Joanna Russ and co-editor of The Cambridge Companion to Science Fiction and The Cambridge Companion to Fantasy Literature. From her academic background in Quaker history, Mendelsohn has also published the book Quaker Relief Work in the Spanish Civil War. Paul Saint-Amour is Associate Professor of English at University of Pennsylvania. Saint-Amour is the Copyrights, Intellectual Property, and the Literary Imagination won the MLA Prize for a first book. Amour co-edits with Jessica Berman the Modernist Latitudes book series at Columbia University Press. He edited the volume Modernism and Copyright for Oxford University Press's Modernist Literature and Culture series and has just completed a book entitled Tense Future, Modernism, Total War, Encyclopedic Form. Please join me in welcoming these wonderful guests.
So I think I'm first up and I need to make the tech work, so just give me a minute. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it. Nope. There we go. All right, not so bad. So I want to say really warm thanks to Ashley for organizing this. She's been working on this for a year, and it shows. This is an amazing collection of people, and the students' work sounds fabulous, very interactive, and I'm just really pleased to be here and looking forward to the conversation. So thanks, Ashley. And of course also to the Haverford community for inviting us and sponsoring this. I want to speak briefly today about the role of form and images in our ethical responses to war, especially in connection to Virginia Woolf's Three Guineas. And I know many of you have been doing a lot of reading and thinking about it, so I'm just going to dive right in, and we are going to be quick here, and this is not a formal talk. Looking at Virginia Woolf's feminist anti-war essay, Three Guineas, in relation to the visual media that emerged from Spain during the Civil War, which I'm about to show you, helps us to recognize the power of images to function as propaganda. In other words, to influence the beliefs, thoughts, and actions of a group of people, often through direct play with their emotions. It also helps us recognize the importance of the formal construction of the image, or in the opposite sense, what I'm going to argue, the formal structure of Woolf's essay, which resists this function of the propaganda image. And perhaps it begins to answer some of Ashley's questions about what kinds of models might we have for the response to war that might be appropriate really for us today as well. Three Guineas is perhaps most famous for the connection it makes between the Spanish Civil War, or military nationalism more generally, and domestic patriarchy in England. Woolf asks us to recognize the links between domestic life and public politics, between patriarchal dominance in the British home and warfare abroad in Spain, or between the home front and the battlefront. When, at the end of her first response to a letter writer, she says, "Here the dictator is among us, raising his ugly head, spitting his poison. Should we not help women to crush him in our own country before we ask her to help us crush him abroad?" She is not only connecting the authoritarian attitudes of a dictator abroad with patriarchal behavior at home, but also writing about the danger of allowing the violence of the public sphere to infiltrate domestic life and the peril posed by the erasure of the status of the non-combatant, whether through mechanisms of total warfare or through patriarchy. In this sense, Woolf's radical feminist argument arises in direct response to an ongoing conversation with the propaganda surrounding the Civil War in Spain. I'm actually not going to read that quote. By interrupting the documentary impulse, disrupting the personalization of warfare, and structuring her often very ironic argument as a series of ellipses, hiatuses, switchbacks, and substitutions, Woolf at once resists the fusion of emotions that characterizes propaganda and combats the erasure of different categories of experience that accompany modern warfare. And I've given you Orwell's quote about Spain because this is a particular moment where the question of who's seeing what is always up for grabs and how they're presenting it to you. The visual media that emerged from Spain in the years between 36 and 39 underscore the connections between war and private life that Woolf explores in Three Guineas. At the same time, they also often blur the lines between documentary reporting and propaganda, which you might expect to be at opposite ends of the spectrum, and that's why Orwell's quote is important. Ironically, the Spanish Civil War marked a founding moment for what we now call photojournalism, which grew out of the total warfare that merged home and battlefront in the streets of Madrid and Guernica. As Sontag remarks, ever since cameras were invented in 1839, photography has kept company with death. But Spain was the first war in which there were photographers in place with portable cameras to take documentary war images and send them back to print in the general press. In this sense, the moment is really comparable to that of the Vietnam era when TV all of a sudden was beaming back these images of the war front, and ordinary citizens could see them in their living rooms. And I would argue it's also not that dissimilar from contemporary situations, the more recent Arab Spring, for example, when cell phone cameras and internet images beamed global revolutions into our hands and laps everywhere we were. So this is a similar kind of technological moment, and we need to think about the technology and media of war, I think, in our contemporary moment through this lens. Advances in the 20s were better handheld cameras, faster shutters, new film, better flash, meant that you could actually do photojournalism, which you couldn't before this point. Photojournalists were already on the ground during the siege of Madrid. They sent back images of street fighting, like these. These are from the Library of Congress. And they brought these dramatic, They brought these dramatic images to the world. The photographs of Guernica, which Ashley alluded to in terms of Picasso's famous painting, but there were photos like this of the destruction, were used to buttress both sides of the claims to who was at fault in that bombing raid. So it's one of those moments where you can see that a photograph can be used in many directions. In many ways, Wolf's essay seems to share the documentary impulse of the photojournalists. We have almost a quarter of the total length of Three Guineas taken up by footnotes. She cites 92 books, 49 periodical sources, but none of the photographs included in Three Guineas come from Spain or depict a war scene. And in this sense, I argue, she undermines this impulse. And she replaces it with a narrative politics of hiatus, involution, substitution, disruption of the documentary. It's likely that Wolf was looking at actual photographs when she was writing Three Guineas. We don't know. She didn't put them in her scrapbook, but she might have been looking at one of the many propaganda posters that were disseminated in Britain in 1936, which make extensive use of those quasi-journalistic photographic images. And I've got this one here for you so you can see how the photojournalism gets transformed into propaganda, right? And for the remaining time here, I'm just going to page through a few of these images, and we can talk very briefly about what they are. These are images from both sides. So this is fascism. This is the Red Cross International. Misery, destruction, persecution, and death. And you've got, this very dramatic spill of blood here. This is the Phalange, which is Franco's side of the struggle, right? These are the fascists. And they use fewer of the photographic images. Here we have a sort of an uplifting nationalist image, clearly a flag. To speak of the Phalange is to name Spain. And here, also a fascist image. Never is what it says. And clearly we here have the Republican forces depicted as a monster and the fascist soldiers. But what I want to call your attention to are the images of the women and children, which populate many, many of these posters. And you can see these all online, anybody who wants to. UCSD has a fabulous collection of these posters. Library of Congress also has them up. One of the things that I want to claim is that first of all, that Wolf was aware of these photos, but also that they are all mobilizing these images of women and children that the violence is there to protect, right? And that one of the ways that Wolf is recasting the debate in Three Guineas is to refuse to mobilize the women and children, refuse to depict the non-combatants who are blown out in the images that she's not producing to you, and to speak to us about the ways that the emotional response to something like this, right, women and children fleeing the bloodshed in Asturias, or here we get the mobilized again, and this is a painting, but it is meant to be sort of hyper-realistic, right, to come from a photo. We accused the fascists of being assassins. women and children, innocent women and children are falling. Here's another fascist picture. And here at the end, I just want to show you, and these are reproduced in my book, so I think some students have seen this. This is likely the photo that she was looking at when she was writing about the problem of the photos from the war. This is a page that was printed in the Daily Worker in London. Clearly the use of that same photo from the Republicans in Spain. These were sent out all over Europe. They produced posters. And I think these images and Woolf's narration together ask us to think, what are we doing to prevent this, meaning not only the war, but also the kind of propaganda, emotional response that you get from that kind of an image. And I'm going to stop there. We'll discuss more later. Thank you.
Thank you. I might actually edit mine slightly as I go to pick up some of the points that have just been raised, because what I was asked to do, actually, do you mind if I leave that up? No, it's kind of relevant. That one. Let me just put that one back up, because it's kind of relevant to some of what I want to say. What I was asked to do was to talk about the relationship between pacifism, peace, and social justice for the Friends. Now, what I do want to say is that unlike everybody else here, I'm talking about really old work for me. This is my PhD. I graduated in 1997. Okay, even with the book coming out in 2002, I returned to this work because Ashley asked me to. Okay, and thank you very much, by the way, Ashley. I am an active Quaker, and so in that sense, the themes and issues are still relevant to me, but the academic work is quite some time ago. But I wanted to just recap how we get to the point that the Friends are working in Spain, and that relationship between pacifism, peace, and social justice. Because what my thesis was supposed to be about was the expression of the peace witness in relief work. What my thesis ended up being about was the degree to which in the interwar period the pacifist witness of the Quakers is reactivated and profoundly changed by the incorporation of the testimony to social justice, which is another testimony. And one of the things I did at the time was to look at a whole range of faith books within the Friends. There's different names for different ones. The British one is Quaker Faith and Practice. And look at the relative positions of the peace testimony and the social justice testimony and the way they moved up and down. And at the start of the period I'm writing about, the peace testimony is in the top 3. The social justice testimony is in the top 10. I have been fascinated to discover that in the latest revision, they've dropped down to 27 and 31. That's a long way. And I hadn't realised, and I only realised, and I'll be coming to this at the end when you will need paper and pen, because we're actually going through another revision of Quaker Faith and Practice right now, and we've just started reading it again. So we're looking at those testimonies. And you do need to understand that all of these testimonies are an ongoing conversation amongst Quakers. It's a 300-year conversation. It's not static. It's never static. And it's almost always expressed as questions rather than statements. So just to recap, at the end of the 18th century, the Quakers are coming out of their quietist phase. And the stages with which they come out of this are much more connected to social justice than they are to peace. So their peace witness during most of the 19th century remains fairly quietist. They protest peace, they write letters, they go on diplomatic missions. They very much see peace as about maintaining diplomatic relations, maintaining national boundaries. It's a very formal notion of peace. And I've only just remembered this, but there's a book by William Penn that the Quakers actually declined to publish because he challenges that notion of peace. But what they are doing in the 19th century is getting more and more involved with social justice movements. So movements for prison reform, anti-slavery, what else have I written down here? Education. There's a whole bunch of these. Industrial reform. Those are utterly separate from the peace witness, except for an element that we need to take on board, and which is extraordinarily common to reformers generally of the period, which is that they understand their social reform work as a contribution to domestic peace. If you look at British social reform in the 19th and early 20th century, much of the early reform is essentially the movement of the Grand Tories, the landed interest, to reform what they see as the corruption of the cities, and also to keep the industrialists down. And you can't miss that element. There's a tension between the landed interests and the industrialists. By the end of the century, the industrialists, who are mostly what we call liberals with a capital L, members of the Liberal Party or the Whig interest, are starting to see industrial reform as a way to keep the trade unions down and to control the working classes. Okay? So if we take Cadbury, one of the big social reforming industrialists, part of the point of the Bourneville site is not just to provide good conditions for his workers because they think the workers ought to have good conditions. It's because if you have good conditions for the workers, with luck you won't get unions. And one of the consequences is that the social spaces at Cadbury, at Bourneville, are very tightly controlled right the way up until the 1980s when the system starts to break down. No pubs, social clubs, no gambling, no cards. Everything is shaped by this sense of what will create a peaceful community. Now, I don't mean that there are no genuine philanthropists, but you can't separate that philanthropy from an understanding of the way society is developing. And that affects the whole development of the burgeoning welfare state. Most of the British welfare state is developed through an attempt to buy off the working classes. I kind of want to remind our current Prime Minister of this, that if he wants a 19th century welfare state, he might get 19th century riots. But he's forgotten that bit. So pensions, the 8-hour day, support for widows and orphans, all of these are things that are coming to us from two ends. One is the pressure from the working class. The other is the attempt to buy off the working class to undermine the unions. This is important, and it's why I asked for this, because one of the ways that the unions strategize is that they realize they can't argue for shorter hours for men. But if they argue for shorter hours for women and children, they have a moral case. And if you have shorter hours for women and children, you can't run the factory as long. So men get shorter hours as a knock-on effect. So through the 19th century, we get a growing particularism in the rhetoric around welfare, and as we move into the war periods, the rhetoric around relief. And this is true, for example, during strike relief, where increasingly we get this language of innocent children, innocent women. Men and women are being separated into two groups. Now, the Quaker relationship to this is complex. I have found documents in the American Friends Service Archive which could have come straight from the Nazi Party's statements on unions. The Quakers really do not like unions. They see unions in this period as essentially a cause of strife. So for them, unionization breaks with the relationship between master and man. But interestingly, they find abhorrent the idea of the notion of the innocent victim, which is fascinating. So during the Great War, and in particular in the 1930s, the Friends regularly refused to sign petitions which condemns the bombing of women and children, because to do so would suggest it was okay to bomb men. Now that puts them at stark variance to the rest of the rhetoric that's going on. Now, I've completely lost this for a second. At the same time, we see a growing questioning of government policy in all sorts of other ways. The Friends are liberals. They're not socialists, they're not communists, but they definitely lean left. And in the 20s and 30s, they also lean anti-imperialist. So in the letters in the Friends page, we see condemnations of the British bombing of Indian villages, for example, which I didn't even know had happened until I read the pages of the Friend. We see the condemnations of the attempts to break strikes in the Welsh mining valleys. So they're increasingly looking crosswise to the rest of the welfarist movement. And that feeds into some of the attitudes they take into Spain. The difficulty for Friends is that they're not really a mass social action movement. Friends as a whole, and I said this morning, are basically anarchists. We happen to have developed some very good structures for making anarchism work. But the problem with that is that whilst you can have a shared underpinning, there's no basis for shared action. And traditionally, the way Friends action has taken place is that one person has had a concern, capital C, for those of you not come across that phrase, which they then persuade others to follow. And sometimes it can take 30 years to do that, sometimes a mere 3 months. Spain, in fact, builds up remarkably fast because Alfred Jacob, who was originally sent as a missionary in 1935, turns out to write the most charismatic letters. If you ever get the chance to read some of his letters, you should. They're just very winning. And this is where I'm going to slightly segue over to talk about that. Because an individual concern is a private passion. It motivates action, and it may be supported by a meeting or it may not. In the 1930s, the American Friends become quite suspicious of that type of individual concern. You find in the language of you find in the documents the language of professionalism. The most common phrase used by American Quaker workers is, "We're striving to do a professional work," whereas the most common phrase in the British Friends letters are, "We're striving to do a spiritual work." So there's a real difference. What makes the concern special, and to try to fit in with some of the things I've been talking about, is precisely that it's not specifically about the huge project or even about mobilizing others, but it's about mobilizing oneself. And that's unusual. Mobilizing oneself to do what one can, whatever that may be. And if it has a capacity to grow, it's through the landslide principle. Move a pebble, the pebble moves several other pebbles, which moves a rock, which moves several other rocks, ad infinitum, until the thing cascades. And that connects back to some of the things I said about the nature of the reform movements in the 19th century, that there is actually quite a strong mirroring between the way in which welfarist reform developed, you push this, which pushes this, which pushes this, and Quaker concerns. So this is a period in which the two are actually moving quite well structurally. I'm not sure that's so true today. I think Quakers have difficulty actually mobilizing concern because the institutionals of radical change aren't the same anymore. What they believe is that ability to become the pebble, what we believe, is the heart of the creed we don't have, because we don't have a creed. But if we have one, that's kind of it. And because this research is old for me, but at the same time has actually shaped who I became as a writer and a teacher, and this leads into the idea of ethics as writers, and what I want to do with my own writing, and I write on something completely different these days, is to try and put you into the mindset, not of a Quaker per se, but of the kind of person who's active for change. And I want you to think about how you might go from a quietist or negative faith in peace, one that I tend to think of as war resistant, to the activist positive position of a maker of peace, which strictly speaking is what the peace testimony says. People get this one wrong quite frequently. The peace testimony is not a refusal to be part of war. It's an active demand that you take part in the making of peace. There used to be a query in London Yearly Meetings Advice and Queries, which now seems not to be there, but for which me has always been the crucial witness in my personal concern. Hang on. This is probably using the iPad. What do you do to create the conditions for peace in your home? Because that is, after all, where you as a pebble reside, yes? What do you do to create peace in your home? It's a good beginning, And I want you to think about an answer to that. And also, I'm going to just read through some of the things that are currently in London Yearly Meetings, advices and queries. And advices and queries is something that we read through, we read bits from at meeting, but it's kind of a personal guidance. And note, I'm going to give you the number of which queries they are, because I am fascinated at the degree to which these have slid down. 31. We are called to live in the virtue of that life and power that takes away the occasion of all wars. What in your own way of life may contain the seeds of war? What in your own life may contain the seeds of war? 32. Bring into God's light to those emotions, attitudes, and prejudices in yourself which lie at the root of destructive conflict. What are your prejudices? 33. Are you alert to practices here and throughout the world which discriminate against people? How are you working to bring about a just and compassionate society? 36. Do you uphold those are acting under concern, even if their way is not yours? To translate that one into some modern parlance, if somebody stands up for something in your classes, do you back them? If pressure is brought upon you to lower your standard of integrity, are you prepared to resist it? These are all questions that Quakers are expected in Britain to ask of themselves. And the reason I think they're so important is because I think they tie in and make possible the response to number 27. And it's where I come back to my relief workers in Spain, who I talked about this morning. Live adventurously. When choices arise, do you take the way that offers the fullest opportunity for the use of your gifts in the service of God and the community? Now, for most of us, when we look at relief work, we think, how can we possibly help? What can we do? It's too big. Well, lots of people felt that way in 1935, and lots of people did nothing. But quite a few people looked at themselves and answered that set of questions and did do something, whether it was to stand on the corner holding a tin, to write 3 guineas, or to find themselves helping organise play centres in Murcia, or mix milk in Valencia and Barcelona. It's that ability to be a pebble in your life, to be willing to be the first to start a cascade, that I think is the crucial thing the Quakers offer us as a peace witness. Thank you.
Hello. I just wanted to say thank you also for inviting this great panel. I'm actually proud and honored, really, to be speaking with such illustrious company. And thanks to Ashley, of course, and to our host, Haverford College, for inviting us and really putting on a first-class event. It's just a pleasure to be in the midst of trees and a campus. I teach at CUNY. I'm not sure if you know that, if that's come through. Anyway, and I really enjoyed myself this morning. Was it this morning? This afternoon. It was at noon-ish. The class, leading the class in the discussion, along with Paul, about 3 guineas and the short story called A Society by Virginia Woolf. And that's what I want to direct my comments today towards. It is called As If, What If? The Social Imaginaries of Virginia Woolf and Jane Ellen Harrison as Sites of Positive Peace. In her memoir, Reminiscences of a Student's Life, which Virginia Woolf published at Hogarth Press in 1925, Woolf's friend and intellectual mentor, Cambridge classicist Jane Ellen Harrison, wrote, "Family life never attracted me. At its best, it seems to me rather narrow and selfish. At its worst, a private hell. On the other hand, I have a natural gift for community life. If I had been rich, I should have founded a learned community for women. In her short story, A Society, written in 1920, published in 1921 in Monday or Tuesday, but excluded by Leonard Woolf from her posthumously collected collection of short stories in 1944, A Haunted House and Other Stories, and it's been out of print for nearly 60 years, Virginia Woolf creates Harrison's social imaginary, a circle of young women who are determined to find out why men write bad books, make weapons and war, and essentially destroy civilization while continuing to insist that women reproduce. Woolf's obscure, So this is a quote from the story. So we made ourselves into a society for asking questions. Woolf's obscure woman narrator tells us, we agreed that the objects of life were to produce good people and good books, and we vowed solemnly that we would not bear a single child until we were satisfied. The story is a comic send-up of the impoverished and dangerous world the women inhabit, but it also functions as an important site of resistance to war and a challenge to Western exceptionalism, as it envisions a different world, not one based on utopian ideals, but one based on dissent and inquiry. Virginia Woolf yearned for a real conversation and to be part of a fellowship or network of support among women, a learned community which Jane Harrison spoke about and wrote about publicly. While Harrison, as a member of one of the first graduating classes out of Newnham and Girton colleges, these are women's colleges in Cambridge, certainly participated in just such a community by virtue of her education and her publications, she also sought and hoped for an intellectual sisterhood that would be on par with the high level of discourse she engaged in, mostly with her peers, formally educated male colleagues, such as the young classicist Frances Cornford, her longtime friend and correspondent Gilbert Murray, and her ritualist male colleagues. This essay argues that both Virginia Woolf and Jane Ellen Harrison in these examples are engaging in an intellectual discourse and inquiry, asking what if and or behaving as if, creating social imaginaries which challenge assumptions we make about conceptions of ethics, justice, and the common good. Each also makes important contributions to our understanding of positive peace. As Jessica Berman writes in Modernist Commitments, this is a quote, the social imaginary can be the place where the demands of the world become configured, contested, and reconfigured, and where new situations, relationships, and attitudes are created, tested, and put into play. Harrison, like Woolf, sought alternatives to the patriarchal language of the state and to the imperialism and militarism that she saw as responsible for war. Her revisions and reinterpretations of the Olympian gods, as well as her essays, lectures, and speeches as an international scholar, help us to recover Harrison's work on peace as she theorizes and envisions a social imaginary, a world we've yet to create. In A Society, which has been read as a precursor to Woolf's later, longer essay, her Pacifist Manifesto, 3 Guineas, Woolf calls for a social recreation, a Harrisonian unity out of multiplicity, wherein women have a voice and a forum to conduct their work and ask questions. Harrison's insistence on women's inclusion and marginalized voices in the status of world citizen resonates with Woolf's plea in 3 Guineas that as a woman I have no country, as a woman I want no country, as a woman my country is the whole world. Jane Marcus traces Woolf's desire for sisterhood to her Quaker aunt Carolyn Stephen, when she asks, with what personal pain and almost erotic longing for escape into a self-governing world of women does Caroline Stephen argue against the desire for freedom from family constraints? The idea of the Quaker pacifist living alone enraged her family. The desire for community and independence from the restrictive moral codes and responsibilities of domestic life haunt the imagination of Virginia Woolf in her dream of a woman's republic, her idealization of girls' schools and women's colleges, because she never experienced his bonding in a society ostensibly predicated on a conception of the common good which did not include or seriously undervalued women. The collectives outlined in A Society, A Room of One's Own, and 3 Guineas demonstrate Woolf's desire to challenge universalist norms and to envision and recreate social groups based on companionship, cooperation, and community, principles outlined by Jane Harrison in her Greek work, in her memoir, and throughout her writing life. These social imaginaries of what if, as if, become for Virginia Woolf purposeful and political acts. As Jessica Berman cautions, constructions of ethical identity and citizenship from a Western standpoint can become problematic for women and others marginalized by assumptions of universality and common principles, which have historically failed to take into account voices or experiences either not represented or underrepresented in the communal understanding of the phrase the body politic. She writes that notions of being in common or community at the heart of any social imaginary can carry implications for regimes of justice and of power, as well as for the constitution of publicly recognized structures of political society. She argues that rather than being simply normative or constitutive of a common morality, social imaginaries should be understood as spheres of justice that guide our actions in the world and generate rhetorical situations and narrative exigency. Models that conceive of community as primordial and inescapable, but not derived from a single universalized experience predicated on normative unity or dependent on a single consensus of justice. When Jane Harrison writes in Ancient Art and Ritual that a heroic society is a contradiction in terms, she is both changing the way we read the classics and resisting universalist doctrines and systems of justice predicated on Western thought. While desirous of the status of world citizen and hopeful for a world based on unity out of multiplicity, today's, we refer to this sometimes as transnational, it's a more transnational critical turn in modernism today, or now, as Susan Stanford Friedman would have it, conceptions of planetary modernisms. She was also, as a woman, anxiously aware of the realities and restrictions of her position in it, on the planet. Nancy K. Miller writes in A Feminist Friendship Archive that women often write themselves out of unremarkable or marginalized circumstances to transform themselves or recreate themselves into remarkable, accomplished human beings. Whether into successful poets, novelists, or academic scholars. Referring to the biographer Diane Middlebrook, Miller writes, "She told her story, I think, under the cover of the biography of another. To write my book, I had to become the biographer of a family I had never known, to become less personal, more transpersonal." Miller writes that to tell her own story, to write her memoir, she looked for the fictional plot that would help her. She joined Middlebrook imaginatively to find and shape her memoir in a process that became a kind of transpersonal self-reinvention. In seeking to upend or subvert the dominant plot of Western modernism, the male quest, the hero's journey, which remains essentially a war story, Woolf was attempting to write a story we've never known, to look for the fictional plot or plots that would help her to articulate her own literary project, to become less personal and more transpersonal. She joins Jane Harrison often imaginatively, but also intellectually and politically in order to do so. With the onset of the Second World War, she becomes once again undermined, anxious, and terrifyingly bored with the national and cultural commitment to the same story, a recipe for disaster she strives to comprehend. She writes in her diary on June 3, 1940, during the evacuation of 340,000 British and French troops from Dunkirk across the Channel to England, that we have now been hard at it, this is a quote from her diary, "We have now been hard at it hero-making. It's the myth-making stage of the war we're in." 2 bombs had dropped that morning in Sussex as Woolf despaired at the same perorations, the lists of dead soldiers, and the curious feeling of no audience, no echo, as among the costs of war. Intense future, modernism, total war, encyclopedic form, which I'm going to imagine Virginia Woolf has read with interest and a degree of gratitude. At least this is how I read it, for crafting a seam of hope by embracing and engaging in, and this is a quote, "the widening of the future conditional space as a means of resistance." Paul K. As a means of resistance, Paul K. St. Amour deploys a theory of weak modernism, which tarries, which refuses to reduce to symptoms, does not advance the wholesale redefinition of, and in general uses modernism as associative instead of definitional, probabilistic instead of binary, and to borrow a phrase, connotative rather than denotative, in order to investigate the forms, political, in order to investigate the form's political commitment and in order to investigate, and this is a quote, sorry, the forms that political commitment takes on the doorstep of a future that looks predetermined. In his chapter on Woolf, he investigates the pervasive trope of the air raid, which is found throughout her diaries, letters, and fiction. He writes, Woolf's writing understands anxiety less as a solitary pathology than as a form, however lamentable, of being and thinking and feeling in common. It's a recognition that people living in the shadow of the raised whip of the world might discover new forms of responsibility and connection to one another, and perhaps new forms of collective action. His softening of the definitional gaze allows us to apprehend Virginia Woolf's own social imaginaries without reducing them to tidy prescriptions or antidotes. His description of Woolf's moments of being as flush with expectation of the future, not only with imminence, with an A, but also with imminence, with an I, produces a generative reading which confronts the potential erasure of literature, the crisis of audience, which Virginia Woolf takes as her subject from Jacob's Room forward in the face of total war, in favor of the possibility at once painful and regenerative that the past could have been other than it was. The social imaginaries of both Woolf and Harrison continued to resist the national hyperbole and myth-making of total war, and their work and example become a means of refusal to accept the compulsory language of the state in favor of what Harrison in one formulary envisions as an infinite party-colored diversity. Thank you.
I'm going to sit if it's okay. I hope that's all right. And I'll try to project. I gather we need to use the microphones for the sake of AV, but I think that they're not actually amplifying outward too much. Well, I want to add my thanks to Ashley Foster, to the thanks you've already heard. She's done such an extraordinary job and has also been such a graceful and generous host. So thank you, Ashley. And to her classes who have welcomed us. Her afternoon class took us in and included us in a really terrific conversation about a society, about which you've now just heard from Jean. It's a privilege to be here with these scholars, and a particular pleasure to be in a room with my friend and teacher, Michael Tratner, who is back there somewhere. Hi, Michael. So in keeping with the rule of threes that Virginia Woolf establishes in Three Guineas, although I think she's also playing with it in some pretty sophisticated ways, I thought I would, in a pretty extemporaneous way, talk about three threads that were standing out with particular boldness for me in this reading of Three Guineas. I didn't give this a title. Maybe it should have been Three Pennies, but we'll just let it be untitled. The first thing I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about is Woolf's relation to this concept and also maybe the phenomenon of total war. And I've learned a great deal from and been inspired by critics who see Three Guineas as writing against total war's conflation of combatants and non-combatants. Jessica Berman has made a particularly eloquent case for the way in which Woolf is continually separating those two groups out. And here, maybe it would help if I paused and just gave just a very brief definition of this phrase, total war, which is one that I think we've heard a lot and maybe lost a little bit of the sort of moment of historical emergence. It's a phrase, la guerre totale, that, as far as I know, is coined in 1916 by Léon Daudet, who is a far-right French journalist. And in his early writings about it, he's mostly talking about the French government's right to eject non-citizens during wartime. So it really begins as a kind of domestic term, but it then quickly is developed into a kind of shorthand for forms of war that disregard any distinction between combatants and non-combatants, that is to say, between soldiers and civilians. And the rationale is that in the 20th century, war is now happening at such a scale that just about every person, institution, space in a nation can be said to be contributing to a national war economy. So that, for instance, if you have workers producing jam, which will then be consumed by soldiers at the front, it's now legitimate to bomb jam factories and those workers themselves and the homes where they live. And you begin to see how the target, the sort of circumference of the legitimate target, begins to widen until it can encompass an entire national totality. And it's become a bit of received wisdom, I think, in Woolf studies that her pacifism is not terribly interested in discourses about war. And this is something that I want to put a little bit of pressure on, because I think that one of the things that is most interesting and inspiring to me about Woolf's work is that she is always curious about what there is to be learned from repellent ideas. That is to say, she's not someone who simply decides she has an allergic reaction to something and then distances herself from it and just wants to negate it from that distance. I think she's often interested in how an idea like total war or a figure such as the dictator can become a kind of aperture through which one can see new things without adopting those ideas, right, without embracing them, but nonetheless trying to enter into the discourse world of something that you find to be repellent and to see whether there are new things to be understood about how to combat that thing or how to live in opposition to it, in a kind of intimate opposition to it. How does this work with respect to total war? Well, I think Farah was just talking about how for Quakers, right, this idea of there being soldiers whom you can kill during wartime with abandon and innocent civilians, right, who are often gendered female, this distinction is one that Quakers reject, right? And I think that it's a distinction that Woolf also rejects, and it's partly because she asks herself, all right, this new idea of total war, right, sees a social totality as connected through injury, through injurability. And if you think about a Woolf novel such as Mrs. Dalloway, for those of you who've read it, right, this is a novel, one of whose chief projects is to take a very wealthy and privileged wife of a member of parliament and a member of a much humbler class who has served in the First World War and is afflicted with PTSD. Two people who have never met, and to entangle their lives through a series of networks, and to suggest that these two people who have never met nonetheless are living in the same sort of social totality that is partly defined by a shared precarity, a shared precariousness, a shared liability to injury. Now, this isn't to say that for Woolf, there's no difference between men and women. There's no difference between combatants and non-combatants. There's no difference between the public and the private. And I think this is another thing that we want to observe about her, that she always then continues to turn the crank of reading and skepticism. And I think in Three Guineas, you can see how she understands that total war wants to make a target of soldiers and civilians when it's looking at the enemy. But how often in those same states, there's a kind of doubling down on gender difference, right? And this is one of the kind of crucial moves in Three Guineas, right, which is to suggest that this kind of absolutism around gender is part of what continues to make war, if not inevitable, at least probable. And here, because I've already given you this sort of notion of looking through the aperture of a repellent idea, here's Woolf writing about the portrait of a dictator. And for her, looking at a portrait of a dictator doesn't make her just want to go like this, right? Fold it up and toss it in the furnace. Instead, it suggests a connection. And she writes that the public and private worlds are inseparably connected, right? This is the connection, or the thing that she learns by thinking about the dictator. That we cannot separate ourselves from that figure, but are ourselves that figure, right? There's a sense that the dictator is writ large what sexism and the willingness to control and dictate to the lives of others, even in one's private life, is writ small, right? So she always wants to establish these kinds of connections. We can talk some more, and I hope we will, about the ways that war is constellating gender and total war in Three Guineas. I want to move on to two shorter points. One of which is to get a little bit to Ashley's question about the relationship between archives and war. And I've gotten really interested in speculative fiction from the 1920s. And although I've come to think of this plot as one that's much more one that belongs to the nuclear era, you begin to see a number of novels in the early 1920s that are imagining the next war as being so devastating that it basically destroys all written records and destroys literacy itself, which maybe those of you who've been reading these speculative fictions for a while isn't surprising, but to me it really was. And the archive becomes endangered in new ways by these large-scale 20th century wars. These big wars require paper, so that they're on the one hand generating huge archives, but they're also consuming them because that paper is necessary to make armaments. And of course, with aerial bombardment, archives are newly endangered. And it's one of the, to me, most haunting kind of historical ironies of Britain in the 20th century, that a lot of the records of the First World War are destroyed in the Blitz. Right? So the very archival traces left by total war are then susceptible to effacement and erasure in a subsequent total war. This is a pretty dark idea, right? That literacy itself could in some way be ended by war. And I think that it's given me a new understanding of why, for Woolf, it's so important to be citing her sources and using public archives, newspapers and biographies and autobiographies and canonical and non-canonical works of literature in this book. It's why, as Jessica was saying a little while ago, 25% of Three Guineas is endnotes. For her, the archive is not just a resource, not just a source of authority, but it's actually a way of thinking about the future. And I think for Woolf, futurity is not so much about reproduction, right? If you're engaged in the field of queer theory these days, there's been a lot of critique and then backlash against the critique about reproductive futurism, right? This idea that the future is something that we can only imagine through the figure of the child, through this kind of heteronormative notion of reproduction. And I think Woolf is much more interested in a kind of archival futurism. And that Three Guineas is, through its own kind of mechanisms, putting that archival futurism next to its the various ways in which it is thinking about biological reproduction, right? It's also following the money. And as I was reading it this time, I found myself thinking about Oscar Wilde's prison letter, De Profundis, which is, if you've read it, it's basically a long IOU to his lover, Bosie. And in a sense, you could see Three Guineas as a kind of long IOU on the part of women who are submitting a kind of demand to be repaid for 500 years of paying into what Woolf calls Arthur's Education Fund, right? That is to say, women who have been denied educational opportunities in order that their brothers can go on to university. And so, this is really a work of large-scale forensic accounting. And I think it illuminates that fact about some of Woolf's other work. But it also, and this is kind of a transition to my last point, I think is an invitation to us to become better forensic accountants in our own pacifism, in our own thinking about the relationship between money, institutions, warfare, gender, and many of the other key terms that Woolf is raising here. On page 112 in my antiquated edition, she describes the Society of Outsiders as making it their business to scrutinize the endowments of the schools and universities and the objects upon which that money is spent. And true enough, probably very few of us in this room have been students or teachers in war colleges or at campuses of the National Defense University. But most US colleges and universities, in one way or another, have had something to do with the GI Bill from 1944 forward, and we can debate the affordances of the GI Bill. post-Sputnik federal research and development expenditures. Certainly the explosion of the humanities during the Cold War rode in on the back of that R&D money. Even if we're humanists, we have colleagues in other disciplines who are receiving money directly or indirectly from the war machine. I'm not saying anything you probably don't know, but just kind of putting it back on the table. And that we therefore institutionally benefit in indirect ways from those lines of funding. I teach at the University of Pennsylvania. We have a big drone lab. We also have a positive psychology program whose curriculum has been bought at great expense by the military in order to endow soldiers with positive psychology as a kind of preemptive bumper against post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is both great and terrifying, a kind of weaponization of happiness. And in the humanities themselves, our general ed curricula in the States, many of them were hatched during the First World War, really is a kind of way of justifying U.S. involvement in that war. If you trace those gen ed curricula back to the moments of their inception, they are wartime curricula. Now, this doesn't mean that, they are permanently stained with an unfading degree of red. But it also doesn't mean that we can lightly and casually detach our institutions and our disciplines from their connections to war making and the production of violence. And I don't know about you, but I don't feel like I'm doing a good enough job of living up to what Woolf is saying the Society of Outsiders is doing. And here I just want to read a brief description in here of what she imagines as the college or university that outsiders will develop. Here's her description. And maybe you can mentally compare this with your own institution or institutions and think about harmonies and dissonances. It is young and poor. Let it therefore take advantage of those qualities and be founded on poverty and youth. Obviously, then, it must be an experimental college, an adventurous college. Let it be built on lines of its own. It must be built not of carved stone and stained glass, but of some cheap, easily combustible material which does not hoard dust and perpetrate traditions. Do not have chapels. Do not have museums and libraries with chained books and first editions under glass cases. Let the pictures and the books be new and always changing. Let it be decorated afresh by each generation with their own hands cheaply. The work of the living is cheap. Often they will give it for the sake of being allowed to do it. Next, what should be taught in the new college, the poor college? Not the arts of dominating other people, not the arts of ruling, of killing, of acquiring land and capital. They require too many overhead expenses, salaries and uniforms and ceremonies. The poor college must teach only the arts that can be taught cheaply and practiced by poor people, such as medicine, mathematics, music, painting, and literature. It should teach the arts of human intercourse, the art of understanding other people's lives and minds, and the little arts of talk, of dress, of cookery that are allied with them. The aim of the new college, the cheap college, should be not to segregate and specialize, but to combine. It should explore the ways in which mind and body can be made to cooperate, discover what new combinations make good wholes in human life. Now, her tone is complex there, and I don't mean to suggest that this ought to be the gold standard of our educational institutions, but that passage to me stands as, at the very least, a query and perhaps a rebuke to some of the ways in which we conduct our institutional business. Again, the point isn't either to insist on purifying our colleges or universities of their past and present contact with violence, but to make that contact a subject in our teaching and learning, to really put it on the table. And maybe I'll try to stress this, to use our complicity with violence in colleges and universities, not as a reason to give up on them or to feel that we can never kind of rinse out that complicity, but to think about complicity as a contact surface, right, as a kind of fulcrum, as a place where we actually have some friction, some leverage in changing the direction of those universities and colleges when we can, to put pressure on administrators and colleagues about the ethics and politics of our research and its funding sources and its destinations outside the academy. I'll just end by saying one of the most exciting things about Woolf's whole career of writing fiction, nonfiction, is that it really resists the idea that there is war literature and then literature that is sort of implicitly peace literature, right? I mean, she's constantly interfering with that way of cutting up the literary world. And so I get queasy when I teach her stuff in courses on war literature. And so I wonder if it might not be better, instead of teaching Woolf's work in, let's say, a course on war literature in an institution that seems not to understand its bond to violence, to teach literature in an institution that we candidly, frankly call the War College, the War University, at least until the time when we can, frankly and credibly, call it the Peace College, the Peace University. Thank you. You're supposed to be opposite her.
I need to be opposite Ashley. The musical chairs is because I need to lip read, so I need a line of sight. There we go.
Farah, just tell me if I'm not sitting rude.
Okay. Now sit so you can see me.
This.
Oh, you can see me.
Because I have a full line of sight. Thank you.
Okay.
Good?
Well, thank you. They were 4 wonderful papers. Thank you so much. And, you know, there's lots of connection and lots of overlap here and generative conversation. So my first question is, did anyone hear anything they particularly really wanted to respond to right away? Or should I frame a question? Go ahead.
The term total war is, as Paul says, coined in 1916, but it's a classic piece of erasure. Most wars have involved attacks on civilians. If we're going to pick a date of total war, the point at which armies start regarding civilians as fair game within written history, well, we could start with the Crusades, because the Crusaders have no hesitation whatsoever in attacking civilian populations, and they aren't necessarily too good at checking they're Muslim either. I'm not a medievalist, but there's at least one occasion where they lay siege to a Christian city and deliberately, torture, burn, etc., etc. And of course, the big total war is the 30 Years' War in Europe, where Germany is devastated. Germany in the 1630s looks pretty much like Syria now. So one of the things that the phrase total war is actually part of is the medievalism of the early 20th century, which my partner's been working on, or I wouldn't know about this, in which there is an attempt to recreate war as a holy thing, as a civilized thing. And both the Germans and the British, not so much the French, interestingly, use images of knights in armour on their propaganda. And that then feeds through to various other organisations and concepts. The one I got interested in is the Girl Guides and the Boy Scouts, who aren't the same as the American version, by the way. They're not the same organisation, who use heavily Arthurian medievalist imagery. So that term total war is a rewrite of what's both happening at the time and of the past, and is a foil to these medievalist images which are supposed to lift and laud the army. So that they're complicated terms. We can use them, but we need to understand that they're doing something. They're an active intervention in the understanding of war.
I would just add that 2 things. One is that, historians often get into this kind of debate about what was the first total war, as if, we could sort of speak in tangible or positivist terms about this. And for me, what's interesting about that phrase is the fact that it comes back into circulation at the moment that it does. And I guess I would venture to say that in certain ways, most wars probably are total in the sense that historically they have endangered civilians. at the same time that no war has been completely total, right? That it is a kind of asymptote that wars approach, in the sense that different civilians are differently endangered, right? Peril in war is differently distributed. And then the second point I want to make about total war is that one of the interesting things that I've sort of discovered in researching that term is that during the 20th century, when people are talking about total war, what they're specifically excluding is violence done by imperial nation states in colonial spaces and other peripheries, right? Total wars are generally between developed states, right? People are always talking, when they talk about total war, they mean England versus France or England versus Germany, et cetera. And so it's a term that also, to double down on your use of erasure, right? It is facing whole worlds of violence that are taking place at smaller scales, but no less devastating scales for the people on the receiving end of the bombs.
I made this point once many years ago to a class, that actually to see it as the First and Second World War is really problematic, because actually most of the European powers are at war with states they don't recognise for the entire interwar period. Mostly Africa and India, of course, but Ireland as well. And we just ignore it. We don't call it war.
I was going to respond to I wanted to talk about non-combatants and the battlefront, so is that okay if we sort of push on?
Yeah, absolutely. I just had a Spanish Civil War comment, so I'm hoping, maybe you'll do it, so.
Well, go ahead and say what you were going to say.
No, I was just going to say that the Spanish Civil War makes this division, at least not the Spanish Civil War itself, but the studies of the Spanish Civil War, is this territory right now where people are trying to claim as the first total war, and there's all sorts of ways that that's being framed narratively. For example, if total war is specifically aerial bombardment, then the Spanish Civil War can be read in some ways as the first total war, but that excludes World War I and all the civilian deaths in World War I. But what it really notably excludes is the colonial violence that's going on in the 1920s and 1935 in the colonies. And so I was just, continue.
Well, can I just say, I mean, that's one thing I think that's effective about what strategies you would deploy in your book.
Talk to them and I can hear you. Talk to them and I can't.
One of the things, the strategies that you deploy when you soften that definitional gaze, and how it helps us telescope out and to include and to sort of act as a site of resistance to that erasure, right, in the work that we do. Because I think that the way that we're using that expression, even perhaps in our posters and in my own thinking, is you know, it's complicated. It's not as, you know, I wasn't even sure when that term originated, or maybe perhaps didn't originate. So I'm happy that you brought that to my attention.
I mean, it is clear that there is a difference between predominantly battlefield wars. Let's take the First World War. It is predominantly a battlefield war, not entirely. And those wars which move a lot, and it's the moving a lot wars that tend to really have an impact upon civilians. But even quite conservative writers are very sardonic about this division. I mean, one of the things that fantasy scholars frequently point out is that Tolkien gives to Eowyn, I think, the sarcastic comment about not being allowed to fight, but they're perfectly happy to leave her behind to die when they lose. So it's not even necessarily a left-right division, but one of the things that, of course, that causes real issues that the Quakers keep pointing out, the Quakers, against their better judgment, get involved predominantly in child relief because it's what they can raise money for relatively uncontroversially. But the thing they get involved with very reluctantly is the bringing of children from Spain to Britain. And it's why I'm not necessarily on the side of we should bring in huge numbers of Syrian refugees, because, first of all, they point out the cost. Okay, it's the most expensive way to support refugees. But the second problem they have, and this may be less of an issue today, where most countries with high levels of education, and Syria is one of those, have raised the age of childhood. Is in the 1930s, kids are working at 14. They're not adults, but they are working at 14. So you bring in a 13-year-old male child, and within a year, he's not a child anymore. And this actually causes real problems, not just because the funders don't necessarily want to feed 14-year-old not children, but because the 14-year-olds don't see themselves as children and want to go back to Spain to fight. So there's tensions both ways when you try to gender children. And I don't mean that you divide them into boys and girls. I mean, literally, I think you raised this point, possibly this morning, maybe just now, I've lost track, that children are gendered female. But not all children stay gendered female. So there's quite a lot of tension around these issues of total war. And you still see this. I think this may be more of an issue in Britain. America, has some funny ideas about trying children as adults. But we've had a couple of cases where the Home Office has gotten special permission to try children as adults. I think the most notorious is the Jamie Bulger case where 2 8-year-olds kidnapped and tortured a 5-year-old to death. And they tried those children as adults, and that's remained controversial all the way. And that ties into the idea that our children are children, but their children aren't children. And you get that in all sorts of, for want of a better term, orientalizing writing about foreign children in wars, if that makes sense.
Well, I think that builds on what Jessica was presenting, right, about recognizability, and what Woolf is talking about in Three Guineas about who gets, who's considered a combatant, who's considered a non-combatant.
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up on that point because I think it's kind of interesting, Farah, that you talk about children as transitioning from the non-combatant to the combatant, right? That I think what Woolf is resisting is the reification of any of these groups, right? So that we have some sense in an image that we can say these are women and children, therefore this is what you should fight for, this is whom you must save. And those media images in particular that I'm trying to call our attention to that continue today always do that, right? They continue to want to frame those people in small boxes, right, and tell us what to feel about them. And the possibility that the answer to what to feel about them is simple is what Woolf was rejecting.
It would be interesting, actually, to have the pictures from Spain and pictures of Syria side by side. A very noticeable thing is that there are always pre-pubertal children in the pictures, always.
Yeah.
And yet our concept of children in American and British publishing, which is the other thing I happen to work on, goes up to about 25 these days. There's a real contrast there.
If you're interested in looking at the pictures next to the Spanish Civil War photos, there are QR codes in the exhibition where you can scan your phone. But that's just my PR announcement for a moment. You have that opportunity in just a second.
Throw us another question.
Well, we have a lot of scholars here who work a great deal in the archives, and Paul brought up the archives in his talk, and one of my main tracks these days is thinking about how we can remobilize these histories, and you actually say it very nicely, or you borrow the term in your book of futures past, Paul. And so I'm wondering, in your own work, how you engage the archives, or how you see yourself as a scholar engaging these narratives of history or certain thematics for a particular ethical outcome or for a particular political trajectory.
Well, I mean, I can speak to that, I think, mostly based on our conversation that we had at lunch briefly about note-taking in our books. Farah is absolutely against that, and I think if I could speak for Paul as well, we were embracing it. I value the annotations in my books, and also in others, and in different scholars and readings that I come across. But I recently had, I guess it's an opportunity, it's definitely an experience, and I was speaking to Ashley about this, of having to go through our boxes of materials from Ashley's mentor, and also she was my mentor as well, Jane Marcus, who passed away in May. And so we've been sorting through her things. So this has been, I mean, just an incredible experience from all kinds of perspectives, personal, but also professional as well. And just to have that opportunity to read her marginal notes, to have that tactile experience of holding on to those materials, and to think about ways in which they're continuing a conversation. What Paul has brought out about the archive and this fear of erasure of the archive, I think, is crucial to our conversations in terms of, moving forward. And it's something that Virginia Woolf was extremely concerned about. No echo, no audience. It's a crisis of audience. Who's going to be looking at this stuff? What are we getting? Who's going to be reading it? And I think that it's something that she's preoccupied as well in Between the Acts. At the end, which is her last novel, where she's considering ways of moving ahead, and how do we do that? How do we act as a challenge to the threat of utter erasure and devastation and destruction? And I also think that the point, one of the reasons I loved your book so much, and I'm going to say it again, is that it is inspiring, and it gives us a way to think about this elimination of our ideas and books and archival materials. In a way, I think that's in keeping with Woolf's considerations of these subjects. She's not afraid to look at that, to look at our own complicity in these issues, and it's a way forward as far as, it makes it a lot easier to dismiss. A lot more difficult to dismiss if we talk about it in these terms, and if we recognize and look at our own sort of function and role and participation in this, I guess, for lack of a better term, military-industrial complex, and the way these are connected to universities.
I want to sort of approach the question from a more concrete position. I spent some time a couple of years ago in archives in India, and one of the things that became very clear to me doing archival work in a very different context, first of all, is the role of the state in constructing the archive. In most places, there are state interests, if not state organizations, that are actually doing the collecting, doing the archiving, doing the sorting, perhaps doing the preserving, or not preserving, as the case may be. That was one of my experiences in the Indian National Archive, is how much is disappearing, how much is not accounted for, how much is crumbling. And then also the experience of working in an archive, and I don't know if this is true for the rest of you, is often that you go, there are two experiences I almost always have. One is that you find so much is not there. It's an experience of what's missing. And then you go looking, and you hope that it's somewhere else. And I think in many places around the world, there are still many, many archives that are not being properly cared for. They are in danger of going missing. And as I remind my kids and my students all the time, that are not digitized. You can't get them on the internet, and that it takes some legwork to find. But the other experience I always have in the archive is serendipity. And that often makes up for what's not there. But it is often opening yourself up to that serendipity that makes it possible to really hear the story of the archive. What is it that it's telling you? When I was reading the early days of radio in India, I was reading about the way that the British colonial government was thinking about the uses of radio. And I was reading all their memos. Well, there were very few memos about the creation of radio itself, but lots of memos about should they or should they not allow politics on air. And you begin to see in those conversations some stories that you're not necessarily looking for in the first place. And I think this is important, again, to bring it back to Woolf, that this sense that Paul pointed out to us about her willingness to look at something that might originally seem to be antithetical or something difficult or something that, maybe it's boring. And that we need to be willing to look and to look again and to try to see what it's telling us. And I think that, to me, is the real lesson of archival work.
I support all of that. I mean, I've been sitting here thinking I haven't been able to get into the archives for a few years, and I'm only slowly going back to archives and reminding myself why I miss it so much. And just to back up something that was just said, traditionally speaking, tyrants burn papers, resistors rescue them. One of my hobby projects, it is a hobby project, as a side effect of something else I'm working on, I ended up looking at novels written about the English Civil War from about the 1740s through to the present. And the reason I did this is because one of the people, well, the person that the actual original book, this is one of those projects that kept spinning off extra projects, so it sounds complicated. But the original book is about a children's author called Geoffrey Treves. None of you will have heard of him, but he wrote, you have, wonderful, amazing. He started writing in 1934. He wrote his last book in 1998. He published 110 books. He's not a great writer, but 110 books, that's amazing. And he pretty much founded children's historical fiction in Britain, or the modern form of it. But one of the claims he makes in his book about children's fiction is that all books about the English Civil War written for children are profoundly royalist. So I went to check this. And this is where archives come in and where I am immensely privileged. We are all immensely privileged because he could not get to the archives. All he will have had access to is his local library and any review copies. And what I discovered is that while he is in fact completely wrong, if anything, the books lean towards Parliament, he happens to be writing just after the Spanish Civil War, think about this, in a period where all the books about the English Civil War are profoundly royalist. So, in fact, it does come back to the war, because what I realised when I read these books is that it isn't Charles I they're writing about. It's Spain. And they are extremely royalist in a way in which the 19th century books just aren't, even when they're pro-king, if that makes sense. They are being fed by the Phalangist agenda. Oh, I did need to make one slight correction. Franco. The Phalangist party is not Franco's party. He pulls them in and essentially destroys them through absorption. He's not actually a fascist, although we think of him as one of the fascist dictators. Sorry, minor point. But to be able to go into the archives and unpick that narrative is an immense privilege. And in the mainstream of my work, which is actually on magazine science fiction, I've been working on it for 20 years, again, you go into the archives and you discover things like that story that has been anthologized 50 times by Horace Gold, a story called The Trouble with Water, that everybody says was an amazingly brilliant story and received with rapture. Turns out the initial readers hated it. The letters pages are full of, this isn't proper fantasy, this isn't science fiction, why are you publishing this? Equally, there's a long-running narrative that science fiction is a boys' genre. Not in the 30s, it wasn't. A chap called Eric Davin went back to the archives and has listed every single female writer that was published. And it's about 15%, which is not bad. You start looking at the letters pages, it actually goes up. And to issues of erasure. The magazines start publishing polls, but to send in the poll, you have to cut it out. And we know from the letters pages that most women aren't buying the magazine themselves. They're reading their brothers' and their fathers' and their husbands' copies. So the method of tracking women readers is actually hiding women readers. Does that make sense? So, and to come back to the point you made, one of the things I love about being a historian is that you don't have to have evidence to prove something. What you need is you need a bit of evidence there, and Ashley and I have been talking about this because I had a paper rejected because of this. Bit of evidence there, some down here, and it creates a kind of hole and a space. And you can say, well, we don't actually have that evidence, but we have this interesting shaped space. And we can talk about that interesting shaped space. And if we're really lucky, one of our graduate students will fill it. But that's what makes archives exciting, that even when you can't find the evidence for the thing you know is there, you can find the evidence to reassure you that that thing is there and that you might find it one day. And you can't get that any other way, I don't think. So I mean, working in archives is a profoundly political thing. If you look at who the big archive historians are, they're almost always challenging an accepted narrative. Not necessarily from any point of view, but the point is that they tend to be challengers of narrative. And I'm not sure you can do anything much more radical as an academic.
I'll try to do this quickly because I can geek out about archive stuff and it gets boring real fast. But one of the people who became kind of a hero while I was working on this book, Tense Future, is a guy named Hilary Jenkinson, who was sort of in charge of the British archives in the 1920s. And he writes a book in 1922 called The Manual of Archive Administration, in which he basically unfurls a kind of ethics of the archive. And for him, there's a kind of imperative, an ethical imperative for archivists to preserve archives in the state that they were when they were abandoned by the people who were generating them, not to delete anything or reorganize stuff. And the main reason is that we can't anticipate from 1922 or 2015 what the uses to which these materials will be put in the future. And we can't even know for certain that it will be historians who are using archival materials. And you can almost kind of hear him thinking, we don't even know if it will be human beings who will be using these archives, right? There's almost a kind of science fiction element to this. And he goes on, while he's spending his nights during the Blitz in the 40s, part of a bucket brigade, like pouring water on the roof of the Public Records Office in London. He's writing a piece about the ethics of the archivist. And there are these two amazing moments in them. One is, in this piece, one is, he says, who knows but that the pattern of holes or things that material traces that we can't even trace, we can't even see now, will be of some significance to a future archivist. So there's a sense that even the material itself will become legible in some way that we can't imagine. And the other thing is, he basically says, if everyone lived according to this ethical code of the archivist, we wouldn't have fascism. And I think what he means is that fascists, and this is really just to underscore what Farah was saying a second ago, delete and deform archives in the name of their own agendas. And according to the way Jenkinson sees it, the archivist is meant to be a kind of celibate figure, right, who doesn't interact with, doesn't mix his or her agenda with those materials, but is a superintendent of them in the name of a future that archivist doesn't attempt to foresee, right? So the veil of the future remains drawn. Now, there may be some self-serving things about that too, but it's kind of a fantastic thing for an archivist to claim in 1940 that we wouldn't be fighting fascism if everyone just acted like an archivist.
Although, I want to mention something, but first I actually want to comment that the Nazis, of course, were fanatical archivists. And I think the point here, though, is tyrants. But actually, I just want to mention, we think of archivists as a kind of indoor job, no heavy lifting, no great political challenges. I do want to mention Khaled Assad, who was killed a month ago by ISIS, who was an archaeologist and archivist in Palmyra, aged 82. Yes. And they beheaded him and hung his body because he refused to disclose the location of the archive. So there can be heroic archivists. We've got a question over there.
Yes. I was going to actually bring over this one.
Could people please wait for the mic? I really am quite deaf and I do need you to use it. Oh, if that means you need to stand up and come to it, that's just fine.
Okay.
You reached right where I was going, which is the weird thing that I see in Woolf is this sense that whatever evils we see in the enemies, they're in us.
Of course. course.
Okay, but right now, the enemy that we're mostly talking about is radical Islamists, right? And things like the archive, you know, they're destroying treasures and all that sort of thing, right? And I'm going to raise something that's just really odd, okay? This is improper, but, you know, it's sort of eerie to see. I saw 2 newspaper articles in the paper, one about Islamists destroying an ancient site. Next to it, an article about removing the Civil War flag. Okay, and it's not that I want to, but I mean, I do want to preserve the Civil War flag in some sense, the same way that fascists are the people that destroy that which seems evil to them. Do you know what I mean? We have to preserve all the parts that are evil in our own society, you know, in some way, in some sort of archive. You know, doesn't mean they're
Doesn't have to be flying over the State House.
doesn't have to be flying over the State
I
House.
think there are
But
distinctions to be
but
made
maybe
between
there
those
should
two
be photographs of it flying over the State House.
Oh, I don't think we'd have any problems with that.
Right, but it's an interesting question, what we decide to eliminate.
But in fact, you're missing a stage out, because one of the things about the battle flag of the Republic, the Confederacy, is precisely that the people who fly it tell a lie about it in the first place. It was not the Confederate flag, and they claim that it is this precious Confederate flag. It's not. It's a battle flag, only used at one particular point. So right from the very beginning, you get lies told about it to defend it. And that in itself is quite telling.
But the fact that it was, I think it even preserves the history of the 1960s when the flags were put up, not just the history of the Civil War. I'm just saying we have our decisions of what things we're going to eliminate.
I'm sorry, it's just a false comparison. Preserving something in an archive, we're all perfectly happy to do that. That's not quite the same as actually flying a flag of people who were considered traitors to the United States.
I'm not.
We don't fly the Jacobite flag.
But we do. Well, but what is preserving
I'm sorry, you're throwing us a straw man. I hear this kind of thing all the time. It's a category mistake. We've talked about preserving. Totally happy to keep the thing in a museum and explain what it is. That's preserving and curating. That's a different thing to the political argument if we want to fly it now, which I personally regard the way America treats flags generally as idolatry anyway, so it's all moot to me.
Let me try and switch from the flags. So that's obviously, and I'm not talking about leaving. I'm certainly not defending leaving it on the building. In our libraries, in our libraries, how many books are there written by absolute racists? We eliminate them. We take them out.
Why? You shouldn't.
Do we?
I've had students try and search just to see what they look like, and there's a sense that we have decisions made like that. So things that we don't like, we also seek to erase. That's all I'm trying to say.
Except I'm saying that's still a straw man, because the answer is we shouldn't.
Okay.
There's a massive difference between deciding not to actively teach something and taking it out of the library. So I no longer teach a book by Roald Dahl called Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, unless I am teaching it to a well-versed children's literature class, because I have seen it destroy creative writing classes, okay? Just destroy. So I choose when I teach it. But I'm not going to go around taking it out of libraries. How utterly pointless. You just turn it into forbidden fruit.
I would like to invite students from the Peace Testimonies class to ask questions.
Yeah, I actually have a question that I think sort of builds off of that, and it's, I guess, mostly for Paul and Jessica. So something that I kind of, when we read Woolf last spring, that I've had trouble kind of figuring out since then is she talks a little bit about kind of the importance of ignoring war, so not just kind of having a negative reaction to it, but ignoring it, so that women should not ask their brothers about war, but they also shouldn't tell them that it's bad. They should just ignore it completely. And that in sort of the way that ignoring a child who's doing something annoying will make them stop not giving people attention about war, and not sort of, I guess, learning about war or going to museums and seeing it can be helpful. And perhaps I'm reading that wrong, but I guess I'm just wondering, like, how does that And sort of what you were talking about, Jessica, with kind of stopping this documentary of seeing these images of war all the time, connect with this idea of like the incredible importance of archives and also being able to remember, I guess, the evils of the past so that we don't repeat them. And yeah, I'm really curious about the tension between those things. And if you
let me just start, and I know you're looking for a quote or something. So
trying to remember what that is.
one of the things that I first think of when you ask that question, which is a very good question, is the importance of the outsider status as an active outsiderhood, right? Rather than simply, and I think there were some original readings or some early readings that understood that as just kind of stepping aside and not taking responsibility or removing yourself from the conversation. And I see Woolf, I think it's one of the most profound statements of what you were talking about as sort of an active peacemaking that I can think of, is this step outside that she proposes for the outsider society. And I think that that's what she means also by the, does she use the word ignore? I can't. That's
Indifference.
Indifference, right? Yeah, I didn't think it was ignore. So that's a studied, positive, active indifference, right? That's what I would say.
Yeah, Jessica's thought a lot more about that than I have. I guess I would just add that maybe one of the things she's after there is to deconsecrate war in the telling of history and in the making of identities. And if you think about what happens, to the First World War into the lighthouse, right? Or even in the story that we discussed today, I think you were in the morning session, is that right?
Last spring.
Oh, I'm sorry. Of course. Sorry. Right. Right. So you weren't there when we were talking about a society, but it's a work of short fiction of some kind that, deletes the 5 years of the war. So the first section ends when the war is being declared, and the second section begins with the Treaty of Versailles. And so it's not as if she's ceasing to think about the war, but she's sort of staging a looking away from the war, which is a different way of keeping it in one's peripheral vision, right? For, I think, critical purposes. And that might be another way to think about one of the things that we see her doing again and again in her fiction and also in Three Guineas, right? Is to see what happens when something that has been a foreground object and has in some ways come to burn a hole in one's cultural blind spot as a result, to see what you can see about it when it is remanded to the peripheral vision.
More student questions? Assuming we're all students, any other student questions? All right, I see a student. Are you shifting that you want the microphone, Linda?
Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
Or I'll make a statement.
Could you make it quite loud?
I'll make a statement. That a lot of the discussion about total war and the difference between soldiers and civilians comes out of the rhetoric of German propaganda already in early 1915 about civilian resistors to German occupation in Belgium and in France. And the term the Germans used to defend their decision to shoot any civilian who is in disguise, who is really a soldier but is shooting back at them and acting like a civilian, is to use the phrase Frankführer, a free shooter, which comes out of the Austro-Prussian War, where the French civilians were turning their guns on the Prussian army and then running away and pretending they were just civilians. In other words, it's the whole rhetoric since the Napoleonic War of guerrillas, and whether guerrillas are civilians since they can so easily merge back in Spain in the Peninsula War, but of course especially in Russia in 1812, and become combatants. And that the other side accepted that, so that the conversations in Versailles about Article 231, about war guilt, but also about who was paying reparations, that the Germans had to pay reparations in Article 224 and 25, whatever it was about German army atrocities against civilians. And the German response was the British committed atrocities against German civilians because of the blockade when we all starved to death during the turn of winter of 1916. So the conversation about total war, it didn't start with Daudet in 1916. It was already starting early in the war in mutual recriminations about atrocities and the way in which civilians became soldiers. And guerrilla, and the very term guerrilla. So that's a comment.
Thanks. I'm just going to add a little piece to this story about total wars, history, and erasure. I'll do what classicists always do in the first place, which is say it happened in antiquity. But actually, the story I want to tell is more about the reception of antiquity. So in Aeschylus's play, The Seven Against Thebes, which is a story about an attack on the city of Thebes and an internecine war between two brothers, the chorus of women of Thebes keep up a perpetual outcry of terror and anticipation in which they envision all the sorts of things that happen specifically to women when a city is sacked. And they take a certain amount of grief for this in the play. The king of Thebes keeps telling them not to scare people, but it keeps up in a kind of crescendo until the city turns out to be going to survive after all. If you look at the way this play has been translated and the comments that translators have made on this, it's very interesting. One thing you get is quite a lot of referring to the women as hysterical women, a kind of dismissal of them. You also get a comment, interesting comment, given what was going on in sort of imperialist wars and so forth in the late 19th century, a translator who basically says, well, you know, we really don't know how to sympathize with these things because it's just so, doesn't happen to us anymore. This experience is too far from us. Gilbert Murray no longer thinks this is something that doesn't happen, but he compares the women to hysterical London women reacting to Zeppelin raids. Reacting to Zeppelin raids in the First World War. So they're still hysterical, but it's a little closer to home. The translators who really first fully sort of recuperate these women's voices and expand them, really in some ways by elaborating on what they're saying past really the point of the Greek, is Helen Bacon and Anthony Hecht, writing via Hecht's experience of having fought in the Second World War and seen the liberated concentration camps, and in the immediate aftermath of the revelation of the My Lai massacre in the Vietnam War. And now suddenly this picture of total war, which has been erased in its reception, comes alive again in a new translation.
Thank you very much. And we are really lucky because our panelists are going to be joining the reception. So if you have any other questions or points of conversation that you want to pick up, please join us in the lobby and sit down with a student who has a laptop open. And that student will show you their project, and they'll demonstrate what we've all been working on as a class together. Eat some food, mill around the exhibition that's just opened, and thank you for coming, and let's thank our panelists.
Thank you, Ashley.
Yes, Ashley. Thanks very much. It's just going to bring in Jane Harrison, but we end it.
I love her. You just have made me so, yeah. And you know, I was thinking about whether Woolf is thinking about Mirrlees's Paris when she's writing A Society, right? Because it's like that same year,
1920.
right? And she has hand set it
Yes.
herself, right?
Yeah, you know, that's
and
an
it's the
interesting
day
question.
that the Treaty of
I didn't
Versailles is
put
signed,
those
right?
together. Yeah, she's setting a type. It comes out in January 1920, so she's setting a type for through December, I think, 1919. Somewhere
So like
there.
within a year of that,
Yeah,
roughly,
yeah.
she writes this story.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Huh. I'll have to check
You
that
know,
out.
and the society is so the reason I read that passage with all the different quotations is because I just love those kinds of like patchworky type things.
Yes.
In a way, Paris is
Very much,
like
yeah.
Before the Wasteland is a cento, right?
Yes, yes, yeah.
So I wonder if she had that.
Yeah, Paris. I teach Paris too. Sometimes. They have a little trouble with that, but it's good. It sends them out looking for all the allusions and references and stuff. So
It is tough, but now I understand the whole I want to call it the Holocene, not